The stagecoach rattled into Coldwater just as the sun broke over the mesa, and Nora Finch stepped down into dust so fine it rose like smoke around her boots. She'd traveled 3 weeks to get here, carrying nothing but a carpet bag and a letter that promised work, teaching work, the respectable kind that kept a woman fed without keeping her owned. The driver tossed her trunk down hard enough to crack the lid, tipped his hat without smiling, and left her standing in front of a saloon that wasn't even open yet. Welcome to nowhere, she thought. A little girl watched her from across the street, barefoot and still as a post, with hair the color of wheat left too long in the field. Nora had been a schoolteacher in St. Louis before the school board decided a widow under 30 was too much temptation for the fathers and too much competition for the mothers. She'd taught multiplication tables to children who showed up in starched collars, and she'd done it well. But Coldwater wasn't St. Louis. The school here was a one-room box with a crooked stove and shutters that didn't close all the way, and the children who showed up on her first morning looked like they'd been dragged from creek beds and hay lofts. 14 students, that's what the letter had promised. She counted 11. Miss Finch, a man's voice came from the doorway, low and careful, like he wasn't sure she'd answer to the name. She turned. He stood with his hat in his hands, tall in the way men got when they worked cattle or split rails all day, shoulders broad enough to fill a doorframe. His shirt was clean but worn pale at the elbows, and his boots had seen more mud than polish. But it was his face that made her pause, weathered, yes, but younger than she'd expected. Maybe 35, tired in a way that didn't come from lack of sleep. I'm Caleb Rustin, he said. Got 2 of your students. Thought I'd bring 'em by myself, make sure they knew where to go. That's kind of you. Not really. He glanced past her into the schoolhouse, then back. They're a handful. Before she could respond, the 2 children appeared behind him like shadows given form. The girl she'd seen earlier, maybe 7 or 8, and a boy a few years older, skinny and suspicious, with his father's eyes but none of his manners. This is Liddy, Caleb said, nudging the girl forward, and that's Ben. Ben didn't look at her. Liddy stared. Good morning, Nora said, crouching slightly to meet Liddy's gaze. I'm Miss Finch. I'll be your teacher. Liddy's mouth opened, then closed. She looked up at her father. She don't talk much, Caleb said quietly, not since her mother passed. The words hung in the air like dust motes, small and impossible to ignore. I'm sorry, Nora said, and meant it. Caleb nodded once, set his hat back on his head. They'll mind you, or they'll answer to me. He left without another word, and Nora watched him go, watched the way his shoulders carried weight that had nothing to do with muscle. The morning went better than she'd expected. Ben sulked in the back row and refused to read aloud, but he didn't cause trouble. Liddy sat in the front, pencil in hand, and wrote her letters with the kind of focus that made Nora's chest ache. The other children were a mix of restless and eager, dirt-smudged and bright-eyed, and by noon she'd learned all their names and half their secrets. At lunch, Liddy stayed inside while the others ran out to play. You don't want to go outside? Nora asked. Liddy shook her head. Are you hungry? I've got an extra biscuit. Another shake. Nora sat down beside her. You know, when I was your age, I didn't talk much either. I was scared I'd say the wrong thing. Liddy looked at her then, really looked, and Nora saw something flicker in her face. Recognition, maybe, or hope. You don't have to talk if you don't want to, Nora said gently, but I'm here if you do. Liddy's hand moved across the slate in front of her, slow and deliberate. When she turned it toward Nora, the words were shaky but clear. You smell like mama. Nora's breath caught. She didn't know what to say to that, didn't know if there was anything to say. What did your mama smell like? She asked finally. Liddy picked up the chalk again. Lavender. Nora touched the collar of her dress, the faint scent of the soap she'd used that morning still clinging to the fabric. Lavender. She'd bought it in St. Louis because it reminded her of her own mother, of Sunday mornings and clean sheets. I'm not your mama, Nora said softly, but I'm glad you told me. Liddy nodded and wiped the slate clean. That evening, Nora walked back to the boarding house with her arms full of papers and her mind full of questions. The town was quiet in the way frontier towns got at dusk, all long shadows and the smell of cook fires. She passed the general store, the blacksmith's shop, the church with its crooked steeple, and wondered how long it would take before Coldwater stopped feeling like exile and started feeling like home. Probably never. A horse stood tied outside the boarding house, and Caleb Rustin sat on the porch steps, hat tipped back, hands folded between his knees. "Mr. Rustin," Nora said, surprised. "Miss Finch," he stood, awkward in a way that suggested he hadn't planned what to say, "wanted to make sure the kids didn't give you trouble." "They were fine. Liddy's a lovely girl, and Ben, well, he's figuring things out." Caleb's jaw tightened. "Ben's angry, has been since his mother died. Don't take it personal." "I won't." He nodded but didn't move to leave. The silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable exactly, but heavy. "She wrote something today," Nora said carefully. "Liddy on her slate." "Yes." "She said I smelled like her mother." Caleb's face changed, just a flicker, gone as fast as it came. "Lavender," he said. "Grace wore it every Sunday." "I didn't mean." "I know." He looked at her then, really looked, and Nora felt the weight of it. She hasn't said anything about Grace in 6 months, written or otherwise, so whatever you're doing, keep doing it. He left before she could respond, and Nora stood on the porch, watching him ride off into the falling dark. The weeks passed in a rhythm she hadn't expected to find. Teaching, gradding, mending the torn pages of borrowed books. The children warmed to her slowly, even Ben, who started reading aloud in a voice so quiet she had to lean in to hear him. Liddy still didn't speak, but she wrote more little notes and questions that Nora answered with the same care she gave to arithmetic problems. Caleb came by most evenings, sometimes with a reason, a question about Ben's schoolwork, a concern about Liddy's silence, and sometimes without one. He'd sit on the porch steps or lean against the rail, and they'd talk about small things: the weather, the price of cattle, the way the town was growing, slow but steady, like a plant pushing up through hard ground. He never talked about his wife, and Nora never asked. But she thought about her, Grace, a woman who'd worn lavender and left behind 2 children who still looked for her in doorways and shadows. One evening, after the children had gone home, Nora found a drawing tucked into Liddy's desk. It was rough, done in pencil, but clear enough. A woman in a long dress, standing in front of a schoolhouse with 2 children holding her hands. She folded it carefully and slipped it into her pocket. That night, Caleb didn't come by, or the night after. By the 3rd evening, Nora caught herself watching the road more than she should have, and the realization made her uneasy. This wasn't why she'd come to Coldwater. She'd come to teach, to build something that belonged to her, not to fall into the orbit of a widower and his grieving children. But when Liddy showed up to school the following Monday with red eyes and a note that said Papa's sick asterisk, Nora didn't hesitate. She dismissed the class early, told Ben to take the other children home, and rode out to the Rustin place with a basket of supplies and a knot of worry in her stomach. The ranch sat at the edge of town, a sprawling collection of weathered buildings and corrals that spoke to years of hard work. Nora tied her horse to the fence and knocked on the door. Liddy answered, still in her nightgown. "Where's your father?" Liddy pointed upstairs. The room was dim, curtains drawn, and Caleb lay in bed with his shirt soaked through and his face flushed with fever. He looked up when she came in, eyes glassy and unfocused. "Miss Finch." "Don't talk." Nora set the basket down and pressed a hand to his forehead. He was burning. "When did this start?" "Couple days ago." "And you didn't tell anyone?" "Didn't seem worth the fuss." "You're an idiot," she said, and went to work. She spent the next 3 days at the Rustin ranch, sleeping in the chair beside Caleb's bed, wiping his face with cool cloths, coaxing him to drink water and eat broth. Liddy and Ben hovered nearby, quiet and watchful, and Nora did her best to keep them calm. On the 3rd night, Caleb's fever broke. He woke just after midnight, groggy but coherent, and found Nora slumped in the chair, asleep with her head tilted against the wall. "Nora," he said, and the sound of her first name in his voice startled her awake. "You're awake. You stayed." "Of course I stayed." He looked at her for a long time, something shifting in his face. "Grace would have liked you." Nora's throat tightened. "I'm not trying to replace her." "I know." He reached for her hand, hesitated, then took it anyway. His palm was rough, warm, and steady. "But maybe that's not what we need. Maybe we just need you." She didn't pull away. The town noticed, of course. Small towns always did. The whispers started slow, just murmurs at the general store, sideways glances at church, but they grew. The widow and the schoolteacher. Too soon, some said. Not proper, said others. Nora heard it all and ignored most of it. But when Mrs. Calloway, the preacher's wife, cornered her after Sunday service and suggested that perhaps Miss Finch should consider the example she was setting for the children, Nora's patience cracked. "I've set no example but hard work and kindness," she said, voice low and sharp. "If that offends you, Mrs. Calloway, I suggest you examine your own conscience." She walked away before the woman could respond, her hands shaking. Caleb found her that evening, sitting on the porch of the boarding house with her arms wrapped around her knees. "Heard you gave Irma Calloway an earful," he said, settling beside her. "She deserved it." "Probably." He was quiet for a moment. "Is it too much, the talk?" "I don't care what they say about me, but I care what they say about Liddy and Ben. They're fine, better than fine, actually." Nora looked at him. "Are they?" Liddy smiled yesterday, really smiled, first time since Grace died. His voice cracked slightly. "And Ben asked if you'd be at supper tonight. That's as close to an invitation as he's ever given anyone." "I don't want to hurt them, Caleb." "You won't." He took her hand again, laced his fingers through hers. "You couldn't if you tried." The autumn social was the biggest event Coldwater had all year, and Nora almost didn't go. But Liddy begged her, actually tugged on her sleeve and pointed to her slate, where she'd written "Please come," and Nora couldn't refuse. The barn was strung with lanterns and full of music, fiddles and guitars, and the sound of boots on wooden floors. Nora stood near the refreshment table, watching couples spin past, and tried not to feel out of place. Caleb appeared at her elbow, clean-shaven and wearing a shirt she'd never seen before. "You look nice," she said. "So do you." He offered his hand. "Dance with me." She hesitated. Every eye in the barn would be on them, every tongue would wag. But Caleb was looking at her like she was the only person in the room, and Liddy was watching from the corner with something that looked like hope, and Nora realized she didn't care anymore. She took his hand. They danced, slow and careful, and Nora let herself lean into him, just slightly, just enough to feel the warmth of him and the steadiness. The music swelled around them, and for a moment, just a moment, the world felt right. When the song ended, Caleb didn't let go. "I love you," he said, quiet enough that only she could hear. "I know it's too soon and I know people will talk, but I don't care. I love you, Nora." Her eyes burned. "I love you too." Liddy ran up to them then, breathless and bright-eyed, and threw her arms around Nora's waist. And for the first time since Nora had arrived in Coldwater, Liddy spoke. "Mama," she said, the word small and fragile and perfect. Nora knelt down and pulled her close, tears streaming down her face, and Caleb knelt beside them, his arms around both of them, and the barn full of people faded into nothing. Later, when the social ended and the lanterns were snuffed out one by one, Nora stood on the porch of the Rustin ranch with Caleb's coat around her shoulders and the stars spread out overhead. Ben and Liddy were asleep inside, safe and whole, and the night air smelled like hay and dust and lavender. "Think you'll stay?" Caleb asked. Nora looked at him, at the man who'd given her a place to belong, at the home she hadn't known she was looking for. "I'm already home," she said. And she was.